Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Tom and the Berkeley Center for sponsoring this. I hope it'll be a fruitful reflection for all of us. The Islamic political tradition, can it be saved? I love these simple questions. I don't think we can view this in isolation, and so what I'm going to try and do is flesh it out in terms of the wider global context. The first question is, what is it to be saved from? And one might say jihadism. Jihadism, this endless supply of suicide victims deployed in a battle of heaven against earth. I would suggest that this is a very impoverished understanding of religion, this notion of jihadism. It's not religion as morality, that is something that's demonstrably good for this world, but it's rather religion as identity, a narrow, otherworldly identity to be enthroned over this world. And so really what we have going on with jihadism is not Islam per se, but it is a rebellion against the world, and a rebellion against the world. And so the question is how to reconcile this group to the world. So first of all, we should ask what should not be saved of the Islamic political tradition, and I would suggest that it is a division of the world into two camps: the abode of Islam and the abode of war, and all the various derivative abodes from that. All of these are problematic. They might have worked in an age of empire, but they don't work today in an age of globalization. Besides, the concept, the division, is not in the Quran itself. So if that's it, if that's the Islamic political tradition, well then no, it can't be saved in this sense. In this sense, it will always be susceptible to a existential division of the world and disdain for others. Today, the reality is we live in one abode, the abode of the human being, Dar al-Insan. So, yes, okay, what about all these other things going on? Ethno-nationalism, ethno-confessionalism, these concepts will always be with us. In a way, they're natural. It's a natural thing to be part of a group, to identify with a group. Assimilation into a single global way of life is not going to happen. It's not possible and it's not desirable. But within that reality, we can be guided by a sense of morality, not identity, in our relations with others. And this is the troubling issue. This is the troubling issue today, that the globe has lost its moral compass in the way peoples, groups interact. That politics is about controlling the world's peoples and resources rather than being in a moral relation with them. Sure, we have democracy and human rights, and those concepts enjoy wide consensus. But we are also realizing that prosperity requires a deeper morality than states alone can provide and guarantee. Just look at the US, for example, our own American context. Think of the extraordinary unethical mindset behind the current subprime mortgage disaster. Okay, or the conclusion of a recent report put out by our own Institute for the Study of Diplomacy here at Georgetown, the conclusion that America lacks strategic purpose. America lacks strategic purpose. Okay, so where have we gotten? The point is not about being good or bad. Our prosperity is at stake. And so we have to see all of this, I would suggest, as part of a larger arc. The moment we live in, we have to use our historical imagination and see that we're actually part of a larger arc. And just to simplify, beginning from the Enlightenment, we have a well-intentioned but problematic idea that progress and prosperity will come about by getting beyond, that is, overcoming the passions and superstitions of religion. Liberate the mind from tradition. Secular thinking is enough. Well, now we're realizing we need both, the secular and religious. Okay? Alone, both can be ambivalent. Scott Appleby at Notre Dame wrote a book called The Ambivalence of the Sacred. The Ambivalence of the Sacred. Religion, he says, can be both. It can be a division, a source of division and conflict, and it can also be a source of liberation. Now, he could have easily written a book with the title ambivalence of the secular, ambivalence of the secular. Many peoples in this world and in Muslim societies experience secularism not only as liberation, but also as oppression. Okay? We don't need Mitch Romney to tell us this, that this is the reality that we live in, that faith needs freedom and freedom needs faith. We are now at a point, this is the worldly reality, where public reasoning is neither solely secular nor solely religious. It is rather religio-secular. Okay, that's a single adjective, religio-secular. Okay, it is that that is operative in public reasoning, and I would argue is vital for civil society. Again, in the US, the polls show that over half the electorate brings their beliefs to the ballot box. Okay, and also, I can say Winifred Sullivan's recent work has shown that beliefs, religious reasoning, is now unabashedly at play in courts of law alongside secular reasoning. And so we're learning how to legally manage religious pluralism, religio-secular pluralism, and religious reasoning is part of that process, part of that public process. And so, what I'd like to say is that all of this is at the very heart of the Islamic political tradition. So it's not whether it can be saved, it's going to have to be saved. Okay, it's part and parcel of the reality of the current moment, this religio-secular moment. And so what I'm saying is that Islam has resources to help us think through the recalibration that we're in the midst of. And it's definitely going to have to be part of similar processes in Muslim societies as they overcome jihadism. So what is the Islamic political tradition? Religious authority and secular authority were never one and the same, but rather they worked together in a complementary fashion for the greater good of society. Politics was never the place where final religious truth was to be worked out. Okay? And religion always had its own domain. It wasn't the state where God was to be manifest or denied. The point is that religion in the Islamic political tradition was never a political identity. There's an old adage in Islam, and I know many of my students are here, and they'll certainly be familiar with it. There's an old adage in Islam that says, rule can last without religion. In fact, it says rule can last with irreligion, but not without justice. So the point is that politics is not about identity, it's about morality. And the point was just that in the Islamic political tradition, that prosperity was not achievable without morality, and religion had a contribution to make to that. Now that's something that baffles us today. We think about bringing about prosperity through, studies of economics and politics. Well, economics and politics are part of it, but so is morals, prosperity. So when it came to the work to be done here on earth, the Islamic tradition said that religious reasoning had no monopoly. It had to be tested against the public good. When it came to law and politics as opposed to theology, truth was never a foregone conclusion. And so the point is that in the Islamic political tradition, religious reasoning coexisted with open inquiry. God was part of the public reasoning, but through a process that recognized that this world is this world and not the other world. Okay, so therefore, religious reasoning in the public sphere was held to a standard. It had to serve an intelligible goal, a public interest in this world. One of the insights of the Islamic political tradition is that religion is a rational actor when it's part of the public good. Now, the problem is with jihadism, it's about inaugurating Judgment Day, the kingdom of God, religious supremacism. It's an identity that claims to have a monopoly on truth, a truth defined totally and finally and once and for all. And I think this comes out if we see the comparison between the Prophet's conquest of Mecca and Hamas's conquest of Gaza. Okay, the Prophet took control of Mecca peacefully. He did not seek revenge on his opponents. He sought to reconcile them. It was not about one identity over against another, but insight into the moral purpose of human society. Now compare that with Hamas's conquest of Gaza. Now they might have had some legitimate grievances, and they did compare it, ironically, to the Prophet's conquest of Mecca. But the point is that they were vengeful in their treatment of their Fatah counterparts. How could they compare it to the Prophet's conquest of Mecca when they were throwing Fatah affiliates off of buildings? Now, here's where I want to get to the crux of the issue in just a minute or two, and then pass things over to the wisdom of Professor Soroush. Because I want to address this country and this university and this society above all. Because the question is always, what does knowledge mean for us, right? Knowledge is one thing, but what does it mean? What does all of this mean for us? The fact that the Islamic political tradition is part of this larger arc that we too are now in the midst of. Okay, and I'd like to suggest this, that for the longest time, and still today, we study Islam in order to control it, not to be in relation, a moral relation with it. And this is going on today. There are countless studies being commissioned on Muslim society by our government and other institutions that are hoping that somehow we'll get to the point where we have all the definitions that will allow us to control it. But then we see, once we've got it all, once we've got all these definitions mapped out, then Islam has changed. It's always elusive. It's never static. And I think emblematic of this was the recent obsession in DC over a definition for the difference between Sunnis and Shia. There was an incredible obsession with this idea. You know, once we got ourselves into Iraq, and what are the differences between these groups? You know, do you think that a definition is going to solve the problem? Right? Solutions are not about definitions, they're about relations. And so the point is that it's no longer possible to proceed in this fashion in our study of Islam and the Islamic political tradition. You know, we can no longer just decide on a set of definitions to implement, or a government to topple or set up. Okay? Again, it's not a question of good or bad, but proceeding in that fashion, it is now crystal clear, is a threat to ourselves, to our own prosperity. The report says we lack a strategic purpose. So I submit that we can only reclaim a strategic purpose for our politics vis-a-vis Islam and the Islamic political tradition only if we reconceive our strategic purpose when it comes to the study of Islam and the Islamic political tradition, right? So I'm talking about a mind shift here, a paradigm shift, where knowledge is not just an assembly line of definitions, but a possibility of being in relation, possibility for relations, not an assembly line of definitions. And let me give you an example of this. A few summers back in Syria, I was promoting a lecture series on the role of religion in U.S. society that I hope to give. I said to myself, enough, okay, all of this stuff that's happening, fine. You might not like U.S. policies, but don't overlook our rich and varied values, you know, the values of the American heritage. You might not like our policies, but have another look, and that's what I was hoping to do. And so I went to the dean of the Sharia faculty in Damascus, and I told him about my idea, and he said to me, what? You want to make us like you? That's what he said to me. He said, what? You want us to become like you? That's what he thought. And I was taken aback, and we had a wonderful conversation. We had an 8-hour conversation. An 8-hour conversation on everything from the Trinity to Ibn Taymiyyah, right? And he began to see that I wasn't there to just do a quick interview to define him. He saw that I was there to be in relation with him. He saw that I took his tradition very seriously, and that the two of us could think through problems. The two of us together could think through questions of the day, with each other. And what happened? What happened? He began to promote my lecture series with great enthusiasm. The dean of the Sharia faculty in Damascus began to promote my lecture series on the role of religion in U.S. society. Okay? So just to conclude, Condoleezza Rice gave a recent talk here where she called for structural change in the State Department. Right? We need more diplomats in Delhi and Beijing and less in Berlin. Okay, that's the challenge of her generation, but here I'm addressing the students. The challenge of your generation is not a change in the structure of the State Department, but it's a change in the philosophy of the State Department. We need a diplomacy of relationship, a diplomacy of friendship, for the sake of our own interests, okay? And again, I'm talking about a paradigm shift in view of the way I was talking about knowledge. If we want a diplomacy of friendship, we're going to have a paradigm shift. We're going to have a paradigm shift in the way we approach knowledge to one that I would call an epistemology of friendship, knowledge as a source of possibilities for relations. So I would conclude by just saying, if we open up ourselves to this way of thinking about the Islamic political tradition, we may find unexpected and very welcome results. Thank you very much, and I'll turn things over now to Soroush.
Fine, thank you, dear Paul, and I think you set the tone for the whole conference here, and I'm going to add some perhaps new points and something that might create some confrontation between us, which I'm sure it's one of the blessings of such gatherings. Well, I would like to emphasize the identity dimension of Islam, not, of course, in a negative sense, but I would like to remind you that the Prophet of Islam was a very identity-conscious person. And actually, Muslims are very identity conscious, and this is through and due to the religious teachings they receive in school, in the family, and elsewhere. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but one has to use it in a right way. The Prophet of Islam actually was responsible for creating a new identity, i.e. Islam. Of course, again, I have to remind you, and this is the basis and the foundation of my philosophy, perhaps, that there does not exist a single Islam. There are a series of interpretations of Islam. This is always misleading. I mean, when we use the word Islam, when we use the word Christianity and so on, people think that there is one single Islam under this rubric, or perhaps one single interpretation of Christianity, which is not the case. Christianity is a series of interpretations of Christianity. Islam, for that matter, is a series of interpretations of Islam, and so on and so forth. So we better keep in mind this very simple fact, which is a very important and with far-reaching effect. Now, this is my interpretation, that the Prophet of Islam was there in order perhaps to create a new identity. He called it Islam. He was very identity conscious in the sense that he wanted and he emphasized the demarcation between Islam and paganism and Judaism and Christianity and so on and so forth. As we know, and as historical reports tell us quite vividly, roughly after 16 months when the prayer was legislated, and the Muslims actually used to pray to the direction of Jerusalem, the Prophet actually initiated, according to the Quran, the change, and he prayed to God in order to change the direction of the prayer, of the Qibla, as we call it. Actually, the Quran is very explicit on that, and reminds us that perhaps it was not God's initiation, it was the prophet's initiation. He first prayed to God and was very adamant on the point and insisted repeatedly that God perhaps should change the direction of the Qibla, and then he did. So this was the first change, the first identity, indication that he wanted his people, his ummah, to be separate, to be independent, to be demarcated well from other groups, other religions, and in the case of Islam and the Arab Peninsula of the time, Jews and the Christians, and of course the pagans, the polytheists, and so on. So this business of independent identity shaped the mind of Muslims right from the beginning. We are an independent people. We are an independent ummah. We are separate. We are different from others. Although we have got common roots with others, nevertheless, we have got our own identity. That was there in the beginning. And the whole literature in the Quran and the people who came later on and wrote commentaries on the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet, all are imbued with this issue and the mindset of identity, which is not necessarily a bad and a negative thing. After all, we live in a world of identities. Identities become negative when they clash, but if they learn how to make friendship with each other, so they are, not necessarily negative. No, that was the first thing. Now, since we are talking about the politics of Islam and can it be saved, I would like just to remind you of another simple fact, and that is all politics is there in order to protect something. Look at the way of the American style of living. The whole administration, political administration, is there in order to protect this style of living. No doubt about it. And look at the political administration in Iran, for example. They are there in order to protect a particular identity and a particular style of life. And that is the case everywhere, I think. And of course, all politics has got its own philosophical foundations, its own, in the case of religious states, their theological foundations, their theories about human nature, their theories about history, and about many other things. In this case and in this sense, of course, you have got an Islamic political tradition, and they are still at work, and the mind of Muslims are usually familiar with this. Now, at the beginning, the protection actually that the Prophet gave was to the identity, the newborn identity of Islam. That needed protection among an ocean of enemies and adversaries and so on. This is exactly the phase of jihadism, as Paul actually mentioned here. But this is only the first phase. We have got 3 phases in the development of Islam, in the development of Islamic civilization. Let us not forget that this is only one of the phases of the development of this newly born child in order to grow up. It needed protection, and the protection was through jihad and warriorship. Therefore, the most important virtue, you see it in the Quran, you see it in the sayings of the Prophet and his recommendations to Muslims, that warriorship is the most important virtue for a Muslim. Because that was, the time that the Prophet was there was the high time for the protection of the child that was born. And because the enemies were everywhere. So according to the Quran, the mujahideen, the warriors, are the best people. Those people who were ready to sacrifice their souls for the cause of God, for the cause of their ideals and values and virtues and so on. But that was only the first phase. And after the demise of the Prophet, and within as you know, 20, 25 years. Virtually the whole, what we call it, Middle East nowadays was conquered by Muslims. Now this warriorship actually virtually ended there, although we had sporadic, activities here and there later on, but that was the end of it. And it was the first important major expansion of Islamic territory and Islamic identity. It was expanded, but it was not inflated in a bad sense of the word. Now, Muslims became familiar with other cultures, with other civilizations, Egyptian culture, Iranian culture and civilization, and so on. And they enriched their experience, they enriched their understanding of their own religion through their encounter with other civilizations and cultures and so on. So that was a very important phase in the development of Islamic civilization. Muslims at that time and after the conquest of some other lands outside the Arab Peninsula, they became confident that this child now is grown up and it is there in order to remain, in order to survive. Nothing can eradicate it anymore. All fears were virtually gone. They were absolutely, confident. In a religious jargon, actually the promise of God has been fulfilled. Because according to them, God has promised Muslims that the religion will survive and He will protect it, He will support it. They saw that everything was on the right place. So the warriors were not that important anymore. Now new virtues were to develop, were to emerge, the virtue of pen, of writing. We have got a saying which is attributed to the Prophet. It may not be authentic, but it is very important, that the virtue of pen is more important than the virtue of sword. We are not sure that this is from the Prophet, but we can be sure that it reflects the spirit of the time. It tells us that it was a new era in Islamic development, that people realized that the sword was no longer needed like before. The jihadi period was virtually, relatively over. And they needed, people of pen rather than people of sword. Now, we have got two more phases here. The people of pen, first of all, were the people of law. Because when you have got an empire, a big land, you need law and order in order to rule over it. And that was the second period, the development of law. And we had it. It was quite a logical development, a logical consequence of the original and early development of the civilization. Virtually in the second and the 3rd century after the demise of the Prophet, you see the flourishing of the books on law, on hadith, and everything which the fuqaha needed it. And this was another phase of the development, you might call it, of the politics of Islam as well, because the law is the support for the politics. The 3rd phase, of course, is the last and the pinnacle, you might call it, of the Islamic civilization, and that is the emergence of art, of philosophy, of mysticism, fulfilling the higher needs of human beings, so to speak. In each phase, you protect something. At the first phase, the politics protected the identity. In the second phase, politics protected law and order. In the 3rd phase, politics protected higher needs of human soul, i.e. art, philosophy, science, mysticism, and whatever. So the protection was always there. Now, it is a misreading of the history of Islam. It is a misinterpretation of the facts of history to think that jihadism was always the case and always the law and always the principle. That was not really the case. Yes, we had the phase of jihad. It has had its own logic, its own morale, its own rationale, and its own justification. It was there in order to protect, as I said, the newborn child. But then, of course, you passed it, and then you had the phase of law and legality. And after that, you had the phase of science and art and philosophy and so on. So this is virtually the road that the Islamic civilization has paved so far. Now, what about the Muslim identity nowadays? And what about the politics, Islamic politics? Yes, we need an Islamic politics in order to protect something in Islamic Ummah, in order to protect something in Muslim people. But that is not the identity anymore, because the identity is well established. Well established. Even the law of apostasy, as you know, there is a law of apostasy, which is according to, some non-Muslims, very scandalous. You had it in every religion, and you had it in Islam as well. But that law of apostasy was the law belonging to the period of the protection of the identity, i.e. the early phase of the Islamic development, of Islamic politics. The law of apostasy nowadays is obsolete. It virtually does not function anymore, because it was in order to protect identity, and the identity of Islamic Ummah nowadays is well established. Nobody can delete it, nobody can eradicate it, can evaporate it, nothing like that. So it is there for sure. And the survival of the Islamic identity is guaranteed, you might say by history or by God, whichever religion you can choose. But Islamic politics, has got a meaning still, and is needed, and should be saved, not in order to protect the Islamic identity, not in order to protect Islamic law, but in order to protect Islamic ethical values. Now, going back to the jihadi phase, as I said, is a misreading of history, is an anachronism. It is only for a newly born child. It is not for a grown-up entity, which is well established. Now, we need it to protect the Islamic values, the Islamic ethics. Remember, and I remind you, that the Prophet of Islam, declared that he was there just and only in order to protect ethical values. This is a saying well authentic, well authenticated. Therefore, let us let the Islamic politics be saved in order to protect these very precious human, divine values of justice and liberty. This brings me to the end of my introduction. Now, of course, we will expect you to put forward your observations and remarks.
You can come to this microphone.
So you moderate. Yeah, Paul. Of course, there was a very little bit of clash. No clash, no, just like with all due respect. Your students are here as well.
Thank you both for the wonderful presentations. I had a question for Dr. Soroush. You began by stating that Islam it's misleading to confine it into a single rubric. Rather, it is a series of interpretation. Don't you see a danger in that when you are given such an open-ended realm of understanding, that bin Ladens can emerge, as well as people like you? So how do you, what's the danger in that, and what is the future of that definition?
So what are you going to prevent? Emerging of me or emerging of bin Laden?
That's the catch-20 here, the catch-22.
Well, both comes together. honestly, I would say that I am not going to decree that there must be a plurality of interpretation. It is a fact of history. I am just describing, I'm just reporting. When you look back at the history of interpretation, not only in Islam, but also in Christianity, all other religions, for that matter, even in non-divine ideologies, let us say Marxism, for example, you will see that everywhere you encounter a different interpretation. And I am not endorsing all of those interpretations, of course, but this is how how human, knowledge develops. You put forward your own understanding, I put forward my understanding, and then we have got a community of scholars, a community of knowledgeable people, and they will decide, and eventually, in a Darwinian way, the best ideas will survive, and the bad ones and the false ones will die out. This is how it is, and I don't think that anybody can command anybody else in order to say what to say and what not to say. Look at, for example, Sunnis and Shias, Paul mentioned here. My gloss on that is these two are two very gross, different interpretations of Islam, right from the beginning. We had an interpretation which I call it Sunni interpretation, and another one which we call it Shia interpretation. And you see that they are there, for 1400 years, and I don't think that they are going to die, very soon. So they will, remain. And of course, there are many, many small subdivisions inside both of them. So this is a fact of history, and it actually invites us to endeavor and to strive more in order to find the truth. As much as our possibility and our ability, can tell us and can make us achieve. And that is the whole thing. I don't find any way out from this plurality of interpretations.
I might just add to that, the issue isn't perhaps religious authority per se. It's always going to be contested between a learned elite and alternative readings of the religion. But I think what Soroush said is right, is that if the tradition is protected, the divine human tradition, if that's protected, then you won't have bin Ladens. You'll have a plurality of interpretation, but I think bin Laden is a product of a disconnect with the tradition, and you see that, in fact, a recent jihadist ideologue, Imam.
He doesn't see it that way.
Yeah, well, I guess, he doesn't see it that way, but I guess there's an example. He's not very learned, in a way, right? And he's not the leading jihadist ideologue. Even within jihadist circles, he's not highly respected for his knowledge. But there is this important example, Imam Sayyid Sharif, who was in an Egyptian jail for a while, and he is the leading jihadist ideologue. But in Egypt, in his prison experience, and I don't think it's as a result of coercion, as some might say, but he's had long conversations with the ulama from Al-Azhar, and he's recanted jihadism. He sees that this thing that bin Laden promotes is not. So I don't know, maybe if bin Laden had those same conversations, he too might open up, but he's not the most learned of the jihadists. So.
Thank
you. My question is directed to Dr. Soroush, but Professor Beck, you can also touch upon it. Talking about the Islamic tradition and political Islamic thought and so on, the place of Shura in the Sunni tradition vis-a-vis the place of the infallible Imam in the Shia tradition. How did these two concepts play in the development of the political tradition that we are talking about?
Well, okay, you are not going to, to delve us into the Sunni-Shia divide. And, well, yes, in the case of Shi'is, yes, the concept of the infallibility is there, not only for the Prophet, but also for the 12 Imams. This is true. But in the case of the Sunnis, the infallibility is confined only to the Prophet himself, and there is no other person who can be considered as infallible in matters of faith, in matters of, in practice and whatsoever. The difference, the concrete case that I can mention that the difference might lead to is that in the case of the Sunnis, the orthodoxy, came much later than in the Shi'i case. Because we were speaking about the fluidity of interpretation, about the plurality of interpretation, but this plurality was somehow arrested, if you like, in the Shi'i case, because they had infallible imams, and their sayings was no interpretation anymore, was really like the saying of the Prophet on the same footing. For them, the sayings of the imam was infallible, and so they had to follow it. They could not argue it. But in the case of the Sunnis, of course, that was not the case. So the orthodoxy came much later, and the fluidity of theology, of hadith, of commentary, lasted longer. So this is as far as it goes. But I tell you, the idea of shura, I think, is common to both. And I don't think that the infallibility of imam has got anything to do with the shura, because after all, imams were only for 200 years there. So what about after them? And even in the time of imams, let us say most of them or all of them were in Medina. But the Islamic empire was much, much vaster than Medina at the time. So people at other points, even Shiites, the followers of this infallible imam, they had to have their own shura, their own gathering, their own consultation assembly, and so on. So I don't think that the principle of shura has any contradiction whatsoever with the principle of the infallibility of imams, neither in the time of the presence of the imams, nor, indeed, after the demise of them.
I would just add that, there's benefits to be had from both. I'm a Roman Catholic, but I benefit a lot from what Protestants say. And so the Sunnis have this shura, but the Shiites have made a great contribution in emphasizing the aql, the intellect, in weaving that together, philosophy and religious thinking. I think they've done a very sophisticated job, and maybe in that sense they have something even to offer the Sunni position. So to say that these things are somehow leading them apart is one way to look at it, but there is another hadith that says, ikhtilaf al-ummah rahma, right? The differences of the ummah have a source of mercy. You might suggest that that's not an accepted hadith, or you're, oh, well.
May not be a hadith, but it's a very good thing,
Yeah.
So not every good thing is in hadith.
Well, no, that's
no,
not the way it's looked
no,
at.
it doesn't. No, it doesn't mean the negative side of it. It said this is a rahma, and there are many other things which are rahma as well. Yeah.
No. Well, my question then for you is it possible for Sunnis and Shia to look at each other from this point of view, to say, oh, yeah.
Yeah, you may use the mic.
I didn't mean in my words to really bring about the issue of separation or division between both groups, and I call them groups, I don't even call them sects. The question is, because we're talking about the political tradition, how did the concept of shura developed and even not developed? As a matter of fact, the question should be, why hasn't it developed when the Quran says, وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَ بَيْنَهُمْ, and it is addressed to all Muslims, Shia or Sunni. But in reality, it has never been materialized. So when we come to the Shia, they brought the idea of the infallibility of the Imam, and as Professor Soroush said, they have, after the demise of the 12th Imam, to do some other surah between themselves. But the Sunnis also, the autocrats, created a group of people whom they assign, and until today they assign to give them consultation. But it is not the real sense of the shura that the Quran has emphasized. That's why I was trying to allude to.
But if you talk about politics, even in the Sunni tradition, the sultans were not always ready to consult. I mean, the word might have been there
Yeah.
in the texts,
Yes.
but in reality, it wasn't quite in conformity with the Quran.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
ما في اختلاف, huh?
You know, I mean, this shura business was never conceived as, you know, the consultation of the whole ummah. That was not actually the original conception of the shura among the Muslims. All they said about it and the interpretation that most of them gave was the shura was the people of loosening and binding. You know, that was what they put forward. But that even did not materialize. That even did not materialize. The people of bind, ahlul hall wal aqd, loosening and binding. And there was no mechanism for, you know, electing them, for appointing them. There was no mechanism, whether the shura was, you know, something obligatory or maybe just, you know, a luxury. And for most of them, it was a luxury that never materialized. It is a pity, because I would say that most of the Islamic states, actually, they were concerned with order rather than justice. Even justice was subordinate to the issue of order. And that was because most of them were living in the time of turmoil and, you know, uprisings and unrest and many other things. And of course, they had excuses, you know, in order. Therefore, they did not even produce a very good treatise on justice, you know, but order and law and legality was, you know, supreme. So that was why shura became so obsolete, and people really did not care about it.
My question comes out of a great deal of frustration, so I apologize if it's misplaced. But I'm just wondering, we talk about Islamic Jihad and we try to explain it or make it sound better, but actually it seems to me that it's the West, particularly the United States, that has jihad on Islam. And you know, when we talk about peace and world affairs, it's not the Muslim countries as official countries that are attacking the West. In fact, it's the West, or particularly the United States, that is attacking Muslim countries. And there are many, many sections of the United States that have no problem saying, you know, we need to get rid of all Muslims without, you know, mincing any words. And in fact, the tortures at Abu Ghraib were taken out of a ridiculous textbook saying, look, the Arab psyche or the Muslim psyche can be abolished by following these kinds of dehumanizing kinds of, I guess, behaviors or whatever. And I'm just wondering, what good is this? I mean, understanding Islam is good for, you know, the few people here who might be enlightened, but in terms of world peace or world understanding or promoting some kind of better relationship between countries, I feel like this level is so much higher than what the leaders or the people in power or the people in the media need to hear to actually promote world peace. So could you speak on that?
I mean, you're right, jihadism can be secular too. I mean, we have strong tendencies at times towards asserting the American identity over and above everything else. You know, somehow the American identity has to become the universal norm, and that can be a very tempting entree towards our own type of jihadism. You know, we see this in our country. Some people, very powerful groups, have looked at the White House as somehow the agent of fulfilling the Christian religion. You know, we see these things too. So yeah, jihadism is alive at play in all circles. Yeah, why isn't anyone listening to us? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you know, my classes are a captive audience. I guess one has to hope, though, that this type of conversation will lead somewhere. I know there are people here who are involved in all types of cross-cultural and cross-religious dialogue, and I don't think it's the place of states. You know, sometimes I think we've just given the state too much authority when it's really networks of friends and companions. And so somehow, you know, we are at this interesting moment where the modern nation state is in crisis. It's not going away, but it's clearly not the thing that's going to take care of us. You know, I think part of this larger arc that I've outlined also is about recalibrating the limits of the nation state and what it can do, what it should do. I mean, clearly what's going on in Europe with the European Union is part of that development. And so, you know, there's hope. There is hope.
Well, I'm not sure what one can say. I mean, I think the problem is much more deeper than that. I mean, it's not only the present administration in America and in the US vis-a-vis the Muslim world, but I would say the whole Western civilization is at stake. You know, when we talk about the peace, when we talk about, you know, friendship, about dialogue and everything, I think there is something wrong, you know, with this civilization anyway. In the 20th century, it has produced two great wars. You know, Muslims did not initiate the war, the world wars. It has created the atomic bomb. It has, you know, produced chemical warfare and all these things. I call it the virtue of impotence. You know, people who did not produce, you know, this chemical warfare, they did not. Even we Muslims did not produce the, did not create the Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. It is the creation of America. So let us not forget the origin of the problem. Let us not. We talk here about Islam, Islamic teaching, about Islam history and all that, as you said, in order to enlighten the minds which perhaps need some, you know, information about these facts. But let us not forget that the root of the problem is elsewhere. You know, this civilization is there in order to confront, in order to clash. And that's why the theory of clash of civilizations, you know, you hear it from here. That's why the theory of the clash of classes, the class conflict, you know, and the theory of dialogue of civilizations comes from elsewhere, comes from Iran, you know, comes from the Muslim world, comes from the people who are perhaps victims of these invasions. So let us look at the root of the problem. And, but of course, we are aware of our own problems as well. You know, somebody like Bin Laden, who speaks in the name of Islam, you know, he speaks in the name of Islam. And although it is the creation of the US, but nevertheless, now it has become, he is considered as, you know, a person who speaks in the name of Islam. So we should know and we should declare that this is something wrong. This is a deviation from the mainstream. This is not to be taken very seriously. In the history of Islam, we have had many things like this, but we have to go back to the roots of the problem. And if you want to you know, understand it and to penetrate deep into the root of the matter, so you have to take the whole civilization, you know, together in order to, you know, have a better and more correct understanding of the facts.
Hi, my name is Payam Mohseni. I am a Ph.D. candidate here in the Department of Government, and I had two questions. The first, both specifically for Dr. Soroush, but the first is a point of clarification. You speak of multiple Islams, not just a singular Islam. But in your interpretation of the history of Islam and Islam as a child and the phases of Islam, Islam seems very singular. And I just wanted to hear what you could say about that, the difference or the tensions between a singular Islam and multiple Islams. And my second question was about jihad today, from a philosophical position. What is the role of jihad today? What is the position of jihad today? And I'm talking about jihad asghar, jihad as war making. Is it permissible? And if it is, what are its ends? Thank you.
You want to?
Sure, why don't you take the first one? I can talk about jihad.
Right.
You're the master of interpretations.
Well, as far as the plurality of interpretations are concerned, it has got something to do with power. It has got something to do with politics. You know, it has got something to do with authority. You know, if you are the authority and you are given the authority to interpret, therefore your interpretation becomes official, and all other interpretations will become heretical. You know, this is, you know, as far as the power, as far as the politics go. But I mean, apart from that, I don't see that you can have a single authoritative official interpretation of any religion whatsoever. And therefore, we have to leave people free to put forward their interpretations. Heresy from the beginning was something that stemmed from the official interpretation. Heresy does not have any other meanings. When the religion or ideology is associated with political power, then heresy emerges. Heresy, is conceivable. But apart from that, no, you do not have it. So I perhaps defend my own interpretation, and this is my right to do it. But then I do not deny you and I do not deprive you from your right of interpretation and so on. Therefore, not only in the case of interpretations, I think the whole world is a world of plurality. It is a Hegelianism, to try to subsume everything under a single principle. I remember once I was reading Wittgenstein, conversation with a friend of him, and then Hegel was mentioned in the conversation, and he said, there is a big difference between me, Wittgenstein, and Hegel. I look at the differences, whereas he wanted to, merge differences under a single rubric, under a single principle. So if I have understood your question, this is my answer. But about the Jihad Asghar, the Jihad. Well, of course, every community, every nation has got a right to defend itself, no doubt, when it is invaded and if it is in danger. So that is, a human principle. You need not a divine legislation in order to endorse it, in order to, approve it. So that is there. But we had, yes, in Islam, we had two jihads. One that you do it initially. You are not invaded by anybody, but you think that this is your duty to spread Islam. So that is one kind of jihad, and the other one is a defensive jihad. According to most of the jurists, and I'm speaking now about the Shi'i jurists, as far as I know, all of them, most of them, if not all of them, they think that doing jihad in order to spread Islam is no longer valid. And that was only for the time of the Prophet, and that is, over. So only a defensive war, a defensive jihad is valid nowadays.
But if I could just add one thing to that, it seems that defense can be defined in different ways and understood by different ways, and how one is attacked can be in different fronts.
There are technicalities everywhere. These are details. I'm not, an expert, and I'm not going to go into that. But roughly and generally speaking, this is the case.
And of course, jihad at root just means struggle. There are 41 references to jihad in the Quran, and there's no clear one-to-one correspondence between jihad and fighting. Yes, there's references to fighting. They use another word there, qital. You have references to violence too and fighting in the Bible. But jihad is not clearly linked to armed struggle. And this is where I might disagree a little bit with Soroush. I'm not sure if jihad as armed conflict was even necessary in the beginning to protect the baby, and I'm not sure if, in fact, that's what protected the baby, as it were, the new religion. I would say that jihad, if you look at it very carefully in the Quran, it's about clarifying your intention, your devotion to God is really what it is at heart. And I would say that it was the spirit of the Prophet and the companions of the Prophet. It was their intention, their vigorous intention for God is that allowed the Islam to prevail, and not the armed conflict. And so that can be brought to various contexts. I encourage my students, when they are writing a paper, to conduct a jihad, right? This should be a painful experience. It should require struggle. And if not, they have to go back and rewrite it until they have a taste of devotion, a pure intention for knowledge, and not just to get a grade, because then the intention is no longer pure. And so I think jihad is really about clarification of your intention for God. And that can be, and has been throughout the history of Islam, used in so many different ways. So
So your classes are battlegrounds.
Oh, yes.
Making jihad.
Very bloody, very bloody.
Heaven forbid.
I think Professor Soroush touched on this in your previous response, but my question is the Islamic political tradition able to accommodate peaceful pluralism, or is it like this strict orthodoxy like that you see like in wahhabism? Is that just indicative of the ideology of that particular strain, or is that perhaps indicative of the greater spirit of Islam?
Well, human beings have got, different excuses in order to clash, So if you don't have religion or religious sectarianism, then you will, find some other excuses, People thought that if they eradicate perhaps, or through the historical evolution perhaps, if religion is removed from the historical scene, then there will be no reason, no cause, no excuse for clash and confrontation. But that proved wrong, You have got every time, all sorts of excuses and pretexts in order to confront, in order to fight against each other and so on. So religion and religious divide is only one single factor among many. Yes, of course, not only within Islam, within other religions, you always have, some interpretations in order to, make, the friendship and the dialogue impossible, and to promote war and fighting and confrontation. In Islam also, there has been such movements. You mentioned wahhabism. And wahhabism, of course, is a hardline Sunnism, and their main difference with others is theological. I would say that if we emphasize on the theological demarcations, the clash and confrontation will become inevitable. And I remind you and remember what I mentioned from the Prophet. He did not say that he was there in order to, emphasize the theological, differences. He said he was there in order to promote ethical principles. So this is what I actually put my finger on, and I think this is the miracle that one can do miracles with this nowadays, rather than emphasizing over theological differences among us Muslims. We better, come forward with ethical values, and that will guarantee not only the dialogue among different sects inside Islam, but also the friendship and dialogue among Muslims and non-Muslims.
Yeah, I wonder if she's also referring to the question of takfir and bid'ah, the idea that Wahhabism is particularly prone to doing takfir against other Muslims. And I think that's a real concern. Has Wahhabism been good or bad for Islam? I think the verdict is still out, and I think there is, in a way, a kind of a counter movement to Wahhabism that I find in many circles, from Chechnya to Morocco, that are saying, you cannot call, one Muslim cannot call another Muslim a kafir. And I think that is a reliable hadith, if my friend here will confirm it. And yet they do. One person says, I'm a Muslim, and then another says, you're a kafir, you're an infidel. And he's saying that he's a Muslim. So there is something out of order there that really needs to be examined. Even you have some cases in the 90s, 80s and 90s in Egypt, Sudan, Yemen, where the state was deciding whether a Muslim intellectual was a believer or an apostate. The state was deciding that. It's an extraordinary situation. Finally they backed away from it. But the interesting thing about it is that they weren't basing their decision on whether that Muslim intellectual, there's the famous case of the Egyptian Nasser Abu Hamid Zaid or something like that. Yes, thank you. He is saying that he's a Muslim, but they're saying, no, you're not. And in the Islamic political tradition, you can only judge a person's faith on what they claim, on their own profession, not on some examination, inquisitorial examination of their interior form or what their what their writings might say. And so, yeah, I think your question is very appropriate, and I think the verdict is still out on whether Wahhabism, which appeared in the 18th century, has been good or bad for Islam.
Professor, look at that. Professor Heck, I want to return to a theme that you touched upon earlier regarding the epistemology of diplomacy. I was wondering, how can you possibly initiate that shift, given that on both sides, for the U.S. and Iran, U.S.-Iran relations, how can you propagate that shift when both sides seem so dead set to hold on to these interpretations within these political conflicts? For instance, among human rights. For many in the West, there's a problem of people trying to believe that Islam has a treatment of human rights within its own theology, given the fact that Islam focuses in on the equality of the sexes. Verily, I've created man and woman. Forgive me for paraphrasing, but verily, I've created men and women to be equal, as mentioned in the Quran. And I was wondering, how can you initiate the shift, given that both sides seem to be so dead set against these two political conflicts within human rights, and especially within the whole plural democracy tradition, if Islam also provides another treatment for that as well? And also, one last point, I just want to get your own take for both of you in regards to Islam, and if Islam, at least within political Islam, if that does provide, a requisite treatment, at least for the Western conception of human rights, given that both, at least for Islam's purposes, there is an emphasis on the universality of Islam, but on the other end of that spectrum, there's the universality of human rights.
Okay, some very good questions. Yeah, I guess what I'm talking about is maybe soft diplomacy. It's happening, and it can happen, and I'm just, I guess, calling for it to be consolidated. I mean, in places I've been in, I've seen American cultural centers, involved with the local people, with the government. At another time in Damascus, I gave a talk through the American Cultural Center on the concept of doubt in Islamic thought. And at first it was unsettling for many people. They thought, maybe I was there to undermine their religion or something. But we had a wonderful discussion. And I guess, are we willing to take risks? And so, I mean, we'd have to talk about the details, but I see plenty of opportunities. And I don't know, I mean, maybe what I'm talking about is a kind of diplomacy of friends apart from state institutions. I don't know, maybe I'm being a bit too idealistic. I think of my own relation with the Gulen movement, which is a Turkish-based Muslim movement. Millions of members, schools across the world, a very sophisticated movement. And they seem to have a sense of this diplomacy of friendship. Now, they're not a state institution, but they're partly, in large part, responsible for marginalizing Kemalism in Turkey. Now, this is extraordinary, that a diplomacy of friendship could marginalize the reigning secular ideology of the Turkish state. Obviously, this makes the Gulen movement's leaders a little bit suspect in the eyes of the state. There's tensions there, and I mean, there's just multiple examples of this. It would be a matter of the political will to do it. Whether we, and it might have to be, because $3 trillion is a lot to recover from, and maybe this is the only way forward. Maybe we'll be forced finally to get over some of these vices of power that we have in Western civilization, and enjoy some of the virtues of the impotent as well. Now, your other question on human rights, I mean, well, there are so many different interpretations in Islam about human rights.
Sorry to interrupt. Well, specifically, I wanted to focus in on the version of human rights as seen through the prism of Shia Islam in Iran. Would you be able to, Dr. Soroush?
Shia Islam? Sorry, will you repeat? Say it again.
Shiism. Well, for my question about human rights, I want to get an idea of the optic of Shiism in Iran and with this treatment concerning human rights. Is that something you might be able to discuss?
Well, I mean, honestly, I avoid, talking about Iran and the current politics in Iran. I had enough of it, and I don't want to repeat anything. So, please do not pull my leg. And I can, just tell you that let us make it, more general in order to make it more useful, perhaps. Perhaps it is not a good comparison. Maybe, sorry to say that, not a good question to ask about the human rights and religion, human rights and Islam. Because religions are there in order to teach us our obligations rather than our rights. So if you see that the mention of rights is very scant in all religions, this is not a fault on their part. It is not a flaw, let us say. It is not perhaps a shortcoming. It is not their business. If you look at all prophets, and including, and most importantly, the Prophet of Islam, and what he says and what he does, actually perhaps they, realized that human beings, because of their selfishness, because of their egoism, they follow their rights. Therefore, they wanted to balance it, perhaps. And so they were teachers of human obligations. They were teachers of human duties and responsibilities. It does not necessarily contradict the human rights, but their emphasis is not on rights. It has been left to people for themselves to decide upon it. What they have done and what they have showed us is to be more careful and more attendant, to our responsibilities and our obligations. So this is my, humble gloss on that. So, but apart from that, and going, elsewhere, and looking at the current situation, maybe in Iran or many other places, including here in America, elsewhere. Violations of human rights you can see everywhere. And so it is our duty to observe and to respect human rights. So this is, again, another obligation. This is, again, another duty and responsibility. So it is the responsibility of all of us, everybody, everywhere, to remind us of ourselves and others of our responsibilities, especially vis-a-vis observing and respecting and honoring human rights of all human beings. But as far as the obligations and responsibilities are concerned, it is a different matter. And I would like to say that perhaps too much emphasis on rights nowadays has made us, neglect our responsibilities. This is another shortcoming in our present current culture, which is very important. And I would like to remind you that a draft of a Declaration of Human Responsibilities and Obligations was prepared by the Interaction Council some 10 years ago. Nobody actually paid attention to it. Nobody did listen to it. It is a complementary, it is a balance to the Declaration of Human Rights. So we need both of them, rights and responsibilities. And it is high time to strike a balance between the two. Too much emphasis on each side will, make us neglect the other side.
I would just add that there have been some great contemporary Shi'i contributions to human rights. The former president of Iran, Khatami, for example, has some important contributions to help us expand our understanding of human rights. Human rights are never set, right? You have to struggle for them, and they're always expanding our understanding of them. I guess what I just add is that, in Islam, the idea of rights, you have autonomy from the state, but not necessarily autonomy from God. And so the concept of human autonomy is strong in Islam vis-a-vis siyasa, vis-a-vis the state. You always have rights from that to be, autonomous from the state, but you don't have rights from God. You don't have the right to engage in premarital relations. You don't necessarily have moral autonomy. Islam, and I think, I mean, we'd have to have a whole nother lecture on this, human rights in Islam, but what you see is this interesting development, which is not actually too different from my own Catholic tradition, where you have political liberties, but you don't necessarily have moral liberties. You don't necessarily have a right to have an abortion, but you have a right not to be oppressed by the state. And that's the problem today, where we are connecting the siyasa. When you have a state that claims to be the custodian of religion, when the siyasa says we're the ones that have a claim on the rights of God, then you have this strange situation where you don't have any autonomy vis-a-vis the state. And that's something that, again, has been a bit of a distortion from the Islamic political tradition. So it's a very rich concept. And I would just echo what Soroush said. I think we've gone too far in the direction of autonomy. I'd rather be with people than be alone.
I wanted to ask you that majority of Muslims believe that Quran is the words of God, that a human being cannot come up with such words. And now this new interpretation that you have talked about, if you could elaborate on that issue a bit more to just clarify the matter for me personally. Thank you.
Shall I do it now or after?
No, yeah. If
Okay.
I'll get all, yeah.
All right.
I need to broaden the subject just a little bit. Dr. Soroush, you were one of the key figures that helped establish the present Islamic Republic. So my question is, what made you change so much? And did you become a better Islamic thinker by becoming a more secular person? And what is your opinion on Velayat Faqih? Do you still believe in it? Because you were in power when it was established. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is also to Dr. Soroush. I'm an Iranian. I'm a Muslim by birth. I'm a secular by practice. I'm married to an agnostic, atheist, lapsed Catholic Italian. I'm a feminist. I am many things. And what I worry about is that this political Islam that you talk about is not really tolerant of somebody like me and doesn't want to deal with issues of gender identity, doesn't want to deal with issues of plurality in the broad sense, not plurality just within Islam, or within the religions of the book, but in terms of plurality of secular people. And given that most societies are moving towards broader diversity, can you talk to us a little bit about how political Islam is coping with and going to address and embrace our multiple identities and enable us to live, in peace and harmony effectively? Thank you.
Radical jihadists, in defending the killing of innocent men, women, and children, cite scripture and various arguments that supposedly justify these outrages. You both reject these interpretations and these arguments, but voices from the learned Muslim community sharing your views are feeble and very seldom heard. What do you suggest can be done to change this imbalance and to win this crucial battle?
Earlier in your talk, you spoke about the Prophet and political Islam and promoting ethical principles. However, there are several instances in the Quran that, if you look at by modern light, would not be considered ethical. Giving women half the inheritance rights of men, cutting hands off of thieves, and so on. How would you reconcile promoting ethical principles with the actual textual evidence in the Quran that would speak against what we in the modern world would consider to be unethical practices or beliefs? Thank you.
Shall I begin?
Yeah, you begin.
Okay.
With the last.
Just sorry, the clarification on that last question. What are some of these things that you say are against our beliefs today? Or did you have an example or two? I was daydreaming. Sorry.
I'll try to be more riveting. for example, saying that women should have half the inheritance rights of men, or saying that thieves should have their hands cut off, or, for example, those who bring mischief in the land should be crucified.
Right. Okay.
Statements like those.
I mean, yeah, we certainly have our punishments for crime too, and I guess we'd have to open up the whole tradition again to look at these questions. The fasad fil ard, this idea of corruption in earth, corruption in the land. I mean, I think it's actually a moral question. The Quran, I mean, I can't speak as a religious authority for Islam. I'm thinking of what religious authorities in Islam tell me, and they say that these things are always to be contextualized, right? There's always a fiqh process, right? The Quran says this is a Quran liqawmin yaqilun. This is a Quran for people who think. It doesn't say this is a Quran for qawmin liyahfadun, those liqawmin yahfadun. It doesn't say this is a Quran for people who just memorize. It's a Quran for people who think. And there's a tremendous fiqh heritage which, is there, including these verses on women. But I guess, it's a little bit too lengthy to be able to answer you fully, given the time constraints. So I guess I would just say that there's always been subtleties in Islamic thinking between religious ideals and worldly realities. I mean, for example, the Quran says, the adulterer should be punished, but it also says, and the fiqh heritage affirms, that there should be 4 witnesses to the act of penetration. It's likely that you're going to have a situation like that, So, this is not to make lightly of it, but there's a whole hadith and then a whole fiqh heritage, and not only precedents, but principles. We haven't gotten into that idea. And sometimes principles can trump precedents. There were great scholars, Juwayni and Ghazali, all the way Imam Shatibi and Al-Andalus, who realized that there were some public purposes, that Sharia was given for the good. This is how Ash-Shatibi begins his book on fiqh, that Sharia was given for the welfare of humanity. Therefore, Sharia cannot be implemented if it leads to fitna, right? And this is what we see with Hezbollah, for example, which is a very complex group, but it has decided to give up the drive to establish an Islamic state on the basis of Islamic principles. It's done that. It's not just because, we can't do it, this partly reality, but also partly theory. So there are ways to show that the greater interests of Islam, the greater intentions of the Sharia itself, and Muslim theorists refer to this, maqasid al-Sharia al-Kubra is how they call it, that those intentions of Sharia, right, can even trump the Quran at times. Okay, so it's not clear. And I guess the only other response I'll make, and I'll leave the rest to Soroush, is this question about intolerance or identities. And I'm a big fan of identities. What I said was emphasizing morality, but I think it's important to know your own identity, to develop your own identity in order to be in a fruitful relation, companionship, friendship with others. And so I wonder whether the question that was asked, it assumes a relatively recent conception of religion, religion as this self-contained identity where it's us against them, or this group of Muslims, or this conception of Muslims against other conceptions of Muslims, or even atheism. And what I'm saying is identities are important, but we need to get away from this idea of religion as an identity. If we look at the history of Islam, it was integrating Greek thinking, Persian, pre-Islamic thinking. Religion has always been larger than an identity. It's always been, unfolding in a larger set of categories of the human condition in terms of the kind of greater process of thinking, what is the moral good here? What is best for humans? And you know, Muslims have always been doing that. You know, you have examples along the way that don't do that, of course, in any society. But I guess I would just, you know, make this plea once again that I wonder if we can start to get our mind around a broader conception of religion, you know, such that I can speak with Soroush, you know, about my religion and he about his. We're not different species. He's not like a Muslim giraffe and I'm a Catholic elephant, you know. Religious identity has gotten to that point where we're almost like different species. You know, look at the Hindu gazelles over there, you know, and the Buddhist antelope and all of that, you know. And so I just wonder whether there's an assumption behind your question that you're not completely aware of this concept, that in fact what you're saying is true, that religion is not an identity. And that wasn't the case in the tradition. Do you know that Imam Ghazali? Yeah. But I mean, Muslims were always quoting Socrates, right? Ghazali begins his book on jurisprudence with an introduction to Greek logic. So I take your point in terms of some of the current realities within political Islam. Well, I don't know if you're again assuming a truth of identity that they can't be happy because they don't understand some concept of freedom. So I think you're talking about yourself, okay? But you just talked about hundreds of thousands and millions of Muslim women who, you know. All right. Well, anyways, I think we can agree at least on this. At least we can agree on this, that religion. I think we need to reconceive it and see it as a bridge rather than a source of division.
Well, I mean, I've got just a few words to say about the questions put here. Now, the first one was about the speech of God and whether the Quran is the speech of God. Since it is not a topic that we were going to discuss here, I have to be very brief because I assume that most of the people here, they are not really familiar with the root of the question. But I actually recently said, and it has created quite a big row in Iran and maybe outside Iran later, because it might lead to a greater thing. I think it is self-evident. You know, the Quran is the speech of Muhammad, no doubt about it. But Muhammad was a special person. He was a divine person. Therefore, what he said is considered to be the word of God. So this is the gist of the matter. And I don't think that it contradicts anything in the Islamic literature so far. And I have got a big support from the whole mystical tradition, you know, all the way down from the time of the maybe 2nd century after the demise of the Prophet until now. Virtually all mystics, all Sufis have said that they received revelation, they received inspirations, and they said and they imagined and they were actually absolutely certain that what they received, you know, in their very special moments came to them from God. And they saw it, their inspirations and revelation, not much different from what the Prophet said, save that the Prophet was infallible and theirs was not infallible. So that was, but the nature of the thing was virtually the same. So this is the gist of the matter, but more elaboration on that I made in a recent article which was published, and if you read Persian, and the English version will appear soon. So I will refer you to that in order to get, you know, more elaboration on that. Now, as to the second question, yes, I supported the revolution. I was part of the revolution. It was the most popular uprising in the history of Iran, and the leader of the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, was the most popular leader ever in the history of Iran. Everybody, 99% of the people in Iran supported it, and you know, And I actively actually took part in that, and I praise myself for what I did. But from the time that I saw that perhaps it became somehow different, or perhaps it did not follow the ideals that we actually expected it to do, so I turned to a critic, and I am a critic. This does not mean that I have abandoned my beliefs in Islam or in, I don't know, spiritual values or whatever. I have not become a philosophical, secular person, maybe a political secular, but not a philosophical secular. I have got my own beliefs, and I'm not going, to elaborate on that. But anyway, my difference and my distance from the present, government, the present state in Iran is quite, obvious. Everybody knows about that. And I find my positions quite consistent. I supported something that I liked it, and I am now criticizing something that I do not like it. And this is not a personal like and dislike. It is on the basis of some principles. The principles that I advocated, I supported, is no longer there, unfortunately. Therefore, I am criticizing, and quite consistently. Thirdly, the third question, I think, came from the lady. And every society has got its norms and its, values, and maybe you do not like the values of some societies. So you have to, be careful. You are here, living in the United States. They have their own norms, they have their own values, and you have to honor it, you have to respect it. I am not saying that every norm and value is just, but I'm saying that even if you do not like it, once you are living there, you have to, somehow accommodate, somehow compromise. So there are millions of Muslim women, living in Muslim countries. I know that some of them do not like the situation, but I think most of them, they're happy about their situation. Otherwise, they would have left, So it is, really, if you say, look at the reality, this is the reality. I look at my sister, I look at my mother, I look at my daughters. They're all living in Iran. They might have some complaints, but they are, more or less happy. And like them, many millions of women in Iran, millions of women outside Iran in other Muslim countries. And there are, of course, ladies like you who do not like some of the norms, some of the practices. And you can raise your voice, outside Iran or outside a Muslim country. Here also, you do not enjoy every right that an American enjoy. A non-Muslim inside Muslim countries do not enjoy all the rights that the Muslim enjoy. This is, I think, quite obvious. Like it or not, I am here as a non-American. I do not have the right to vote. I do not have the right to be elected. I do not have right even to stay. I do not have right to work. I do not have the right to become a president, nothing like that. And this is the norm of this country. Once I am here, I somehow, adapt myself to the situation. Maybe I think it is a very cruel. When I want to get a visa, I have to stay and wait for 8 months in order to get my visa. But that is the law, this is the regulation. In all Islamic countries, you have got some regulations, you have got some rules that, more or less, you have to obey. It's like any other place. And of course, if there are laws and regulations which are not just, which are not fair, you have to raise your voice and you have to, take part, or participate actively in order to change them. So this is, after all, what we can do. And what about the... Yes, about Velayat. Oh, yes, that was your question. Well, I do not like Velayat al-Faqih, and I have not liked it, and I have never written about it, and all I have written is against it. I am paying the cost. So this is as far as it goes. Yeah, I think the fifth question, Paul actually took care of that, and I just remind you that look at all these so-called non-moral, non-ethical, regulations in the Quran. You mentioned the law of inheritance, and perhaps there are some other things in your mind. I remind you of two things. First is that, remember, that these regulations have been in practice in all Muslim countries, and no woman, has ever had the feeling of discrimination against them. They found it quite fair. It is nowadays that the women or the people subject to those laws and regulations feel injustice and unfairness. This is because the laws have got some logic behind them, and the logic was there in the past. Maybe nowadays we have lost them. Maybe nowadays, due to the different situation, the logic is not working anymore. So, second point, we have to make a new ijtihad. You see, we have to make a new ijtihad in order to change them according to the different situation. So I remind you that the Muslim community, millions of people, in the past, during, let us say, more than a millennium, 1,000 years, they have been practicing these laws. And they knew all about justice. They knew all about fairness. They were very clever people. They're philosophers. They're thinkers. They never said or wrote anything about these laws or against them as being unjust, because they knew the logic behind it. For example, the law of inheritance that you mentioned, it is incumbent on the husband, to pay all the, expenditures of the family. And it is not on the woman. And so that was the logic they thought was behind the law of inheritance, why there was not an equal share between them. But nowadays, since, both perhaps men and women work outside, and both of them are, paying for the cost of the family, therefore, you know that in Iran, for example, there are some of the jurists emerging who say, and we have got some of them now in Iran at the present time, who say that now the inheritance law should be changed and the shares should become equal. They are making ijtihad even in the very text of the Quran, let alone the text of the sayings of the Prophet. So there are two things here to have in mind. First, they have been, and they had, in the past, a logic, a rationale, and it worked well. And nobody actually felt that he or she has been wronged or has been treated unfairly. And second, there is the gate of ijtihad, which is wide open. And it is the authority of the jurist, of the Shi'i jurist or the Sunni jurist, to change these laws accordingly, within the limits of the maqasid al-Sharia, the goals of the Sharia, as Paul mentioned.
Well, thank you very much for your patience, and keep thinking about these questions.